Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Police Accountability Project. I'm so excited. Today, I have my guest, Bob Gangi. He's the founder of the Police Reform Organizing Project, and he's so knowledgeable and so passionate about police reform issues. So, he's going to talk to us today. Welcome, Bob. Thank you for coming.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm pleased to be here.
All right. So, Bob, tell me a bit about your background and how you came to be the founder of this organization.
Well, I am a child of the 60s, so my politics was shaped, at least in part, by the activities and the sort of the growing perception that young people had then about the country we lived in, about America. So I was raised as a child and as a teenager in the 60s, and then we believed in America. We believed that America was to use an expression I think associated with Ronald Reagan, the shining city on the hill, and that we were righteous and we were a fair and nation that provided opportunity for everybody. And then in my senior year in high school was the beginning of the awakening when our high school history teacher was talking about the Panama Canal and said that Panama, Teddy Roosevelt was president of the United States at that time. He wanted to build what we now know as the Panama Canal. The government in Panama refused to either lease him the land or permit him to build the canal on their land. So, and this is what our history teacher said. So Roosevelt arranged to overthrow the government of Panama and install a government in Panama that would work with the United States and permit the United States to build the Panama Canal. And I was just shocked. The teacher didn't say, this is supposed history. He just presented it as fact. And I was like, wait a second. The United States overthrew the independent government of another nation to suit our interests. I had no idea that the United States did that. And of course, over the years, you found out that the United States overthrew the government, the democratically elected government in Iran, and installed who we wanted to be in there, who would be friendly to us, the Shah, who was a brutal ruler responsible for the deaths of thousands and thousands of Iranian people. And so in the 60s is when we began to learn, young people in college began to learn about the United States' role internationally. We also began to learn about how deeply rooted racism was in our country, primarily in the South, with the Jim Crow laws and the discrimination against black people down South, and the killing and murdering of black people, lynching of black people, without any chance that the person responsible for those crimes would be held accountable by the courts down South. So we learned about that. And then the Vietnam War greatly expanded under Lyndon Johnson, who became president after Jack Kennedy was killed. And we realized fairly early on, 65, 66, 67, fairly early on in the carrying out of that war, that it was a completely unjust war, completely actually contrast to the United States' own international interests, and resulted in the deaths of 58,000 American soldiers and hundreds of thousands of Southeast Asian people. And we were perpetuating that. And so the young people and lots of other people, but to a large degree driven by young people, particularly the anti-war movement. And we knew we might have made some mistakes in promoting the anti-war movement, but we knew we were right. And so that involvement in that activity and awareness that a lot of young people just gained about their country and the terrible things that our country was responsible for shaped my politics. And I got involved in doing social work, if that's the best word for it. But I was working, my first job was to work with Black and Latino young people on the west side of Manhattan. Actually, interestingly enough, primarily on West 84th Street, which is 2 blocks from where Barbara, my wife, and I live now, which is West 86th Street. Now, West 84th Street and most of the west side of Manhattan, the Midwest side of Manhattan, has been gentrified. But then a lot of poor people live there. A lot of African American and Latino young people were growing up there. And there was a gang problem there. And there was a fair amount of sort of inner city type criminal activity, drugs and whatnot. And I began to work with young Black and Latino people. I was young. I mean, I was not much older than they were. They were like 17, 18, 19. I was 22. And it was just eye-opening. So most of the young people I work with most closely were African American, were Black young boys, men, and girls, women. All of them, to a person, had dropped out of high school. And it became clear to me fairly early on the high school did not want them because they were, quote unquote, trouble and had a hard time sitting still and, quote unquote, learning. And the one system that welcomed them, maybe is not quite the right word, but engaged them was the criminal justice system, the police, the courts, jail, and prison. So, and I saw that most of the young people that I was working with and who I cared about deeply had to say 3 strikes against them doesn't even capture how limited their future was and how everybody in that neighborhood had a sense that none of a particular set of young men, boys, were going to quote unquote make it. They would die from a drug overdose or be shot, or they would end up serving long terms in prison. That was considered inevitable for all of them. And I realized that, and it very much shaped my thinking, how deeply unjust that was and arbitrary. I grew up working class Italian family. Actually, my family was relatively poor. My old man had multiple sclerosis and didn't work. But I still was virtually guaranteed a bright future, stayed in school, went to college, and would be able to find some decent employment, make a living. My life, there's no guarantees, right? But I saw that was the path for me, my friends, the people I grew up with. And I saw the path for the Black and Latino young people I was working with was an entirely different path with very few options, with likelihood dead end, likelihood either early death or, again, imprisonment. So that very much shaped my thinking and about how our society operates. And I made a decision early on when I was doing that work was that I wanted to get married. I wanted to have a family. And so I wanted to earn money. But I did not want to do any kind of work other than work that engaged me in social justice issues. And I was lucky enough to be able to do that in the course of my career. The job I had before helping to start PROP, the Police Reform Organizing Project, I was director of an organization called the Correctional Association for a long time, almost 30 years. And the Correctional Association's main purpose was to focus on prison and jail conditions and the use of prison and jail in New York State and New York City. So one of the things you learn immediately is the vast disproportion of people locked up in our jails and our prisons are African American and Latino people, and that was the result in part of mandatory sentencing laws, but also the result in part of how police departments in large urban centers in New York, primarily New York City, how they went around their business, and they went around their business targeting low-income people of color. And also learned more recently about the history of the NYPD, going back to when it was first established in 1845. The police department always targeted marginalized groups from the very beginning. From the beginning, the 2 primary groups they targeted were recent Irish immigrants who had come over from Ireland because of the potato famine in Ireland. So in the 1840s, a large influx of Irish people into New York City. and black people, because New York State had abolished slavery like in 1828, and so there was a somewhat large freed black population in New York City. So those are the two groups that the NYPD primarily targeted and tried to contain. And eventually, ironically, the Irish community kind of got wise to what was happening, and they infiltrated, if that's the right word, the police department. So eventually, Irish people ran the police department and by the 1870s, 1880s. But police still targeted marginalized groups, primarily black people. And then as Italians came over, we discussed earlier, I'm Italian. My family came over early 20th century. And so the police department began to target Italian community also, but primarily the black community. And they were targeting, when the police department targeted Italians, it wasn't because of the mafia. It was just because they were poor or working class, and they were problematic and not accepted into the community, not accepted into the larger social fabric of the city.
So for what you're sharing, it sounds like police have a vested interest in targeting underprivileged communities.
Yes.
Yeah.
The interest, in my judgment, I wouldn't call it their vested interest. It's what they've been set up to do. I mean, it oversimplifies it a bit to say they're primarily serving the class of rich people, the ruling class, the corporate class, the political class. And their primary focus has always been on one way or another targeting marginalized communities. And in New York City, what that came to mean at a certain point was communities of color, primarily black communities. When Latinos began coming over here and coming over to New York City in large numbers, it included the Latino community. Also included other marginalized groups, gay people, sex workers, street vendors, all in one way or another are targeted by the NYPD.
And what about people that say that's just leftist ideology because police are there to protect and to ensure safety? I feel like that's the general mindset of like the average person, you know?
Probably, yeah.
What would you say to someone like that?
You raise a good question, because what I described, I think, will often be identified as you put it, knee-jerk left thinking, left ideology. The problem with that thinking is, although it's hard, it's still a challenge for us, is it's just what I described is just true. It's not, I mean, it may sound as if, a left thinking cynic that is antagonistic to all established institutions, including the police department. To the extent that that would be a true description of me, it's because it is in fact true that the police department and our so-called criminal justice system, I don't like calling it justice system because it is so unjust in how it operates. It's a harsh, harsh truth, and a truth that is very hard for many, many mainstream Americans, primarily white people, to accept. We did a history of the NYPD, calling it the notorious and true history of the NYPD, because we wanted to document historically through almost an academic approach to this. This is the true history. This isn't, again, a function of our again, I use the terms I've been used for, knee-jerk opposition to established institutions. This is how the NYPD has operated since the beginning of time, beginning of its time. And the documentation was all too easy to make because of the history. For example, quick history, there were four committees established by the leadership either in the New York State legislature or in New York City to investigate and examine the practices of the NYPD. And every one of them, every one of them concluded that the NYPD was corrupt, that engaged in brutality, and that the department itself did not sufficiently, to say the least, monitor itself or hold to account or in any way punish the individual officers who were carrying out these corrupt practices or these unnecessarily violent practices or racist practices. The even to the extent that that we included Fiorello LaGuardia in that criticism. LaGuardia is generally considered to be the best mayor that New York City ever had, and he was a progressive. He was, talk about left, he was a man of the left. He was a socialist, but even he didn't move to correct the abuses of the police department. And the best example of that was around, I think it was 1935, there was a police riot in Harlem. LaGuardia appointed a commission to investigate what was behind the quote-unquote riot, and the commission prepared a report that was very critical of the NYPD and also very critical of the living conditions of Black people who lived in Harlem. And LaGuardia shelved the report because he didn't want to be associated with or responsible for a report that was very critical of the NYPD because he feared the political consequences. And then one of the commissions was appointed when David Dinkins was mayor, as you might know, the first Black mayor of New York City.
Right.
And there were rumors and stories about corruption within the police department, in particular precincts. So Dinkins appointed a committee. It's called the Mullen Commission because it was headed by a man named Milt Mullen, who was a very well-regarded judge in New York State. And the Mullen Commission also reached the similar conclusions to the three previous commissions. And what stood out for me were the comments of some police officers, because they managed to have some police officers testify and who spoke very honestly about their own practices. And they talked about, and these individual police officers talked about carrying out brutality on a regular basis. And one officer was asked, well, did you do it because you were trying to expose crime? You know, you were dealing with people involved in crime. And he answered, no, we would just do it regularly to anyone who, for one reason or another, came into our clutches or came into the precinct. And another officer testified, part of the reason we engaged in that kind of rough treatment of New Yorkers, and we're talking about almost entirely dealing with Black and Latino people in this way, one of the reasons we did it was that enabled us to earn the respect of other officers when they saw us carrying out beatings and in other ways intimidating or hurting the people who came into our precinct or that we arrested or that we brought in because they were supposedly witnesses. And one of the things that stood out for me was a comment by one of these officers. And he said, they hate us. And he concluded by saying,
who hates them?
The people in the Black community.
Oh,
and he said,
right.
You would hate us also if you lived there.
Right.
And what it gets to, the reason I went down this path is the question you asked is one of the things the question reveals is the difference between how, overstating this, but it's essentially true, most white people view the NYPD and how most Black people and Latino people view the NYPD. And there's almost a cliche, and I found it to be true when I work with young Black people and I talk to them about it, how their parents will give them the talk, is how careful you have to be when you're interacting with police officers. Mm-hmm. Because you never know when they may overreact or they may decide for their own purposes because they have to make their quota system or because they're just excuse me, fucking racist, and they can take it out on you. And was striking to me. I'll tell you a personal story. I worked with, a black woman. This was many, many years ago. And we both had 18-year-old sons. And both our sons were graduating high school and about to go off to college. And her name was Deborah, probably still is Deborah. So I said to Deborah, I feel this is really going to be hard for me and my wife, Barbara, when Jess leaves. How much we're going to miss him, how he is so much part of our home and older brother to our youngest son, Theo, and how what a just strong presence he had, and how it's going to be hard for us on a day-to-day basis. And Deborah said to me, I don't have that feeling at all. I am happy that my son is going to get out of New York City, because I worry every day and every night when he's out in the community what may happen to him in interaction with the police. And I never, my sons, they're now 50 and 46, so I'm talking about a long time ago. They were out all the time in the city. Yeah. And I never worried. I worried about what might happen and whether they were going to come home, but it wasn't because I was worried about interactions with the police. And that's the experience of, a white middle-class family in the city, as opposed to the experience of many Black and Latino families.
Right.
And that, needless to say, is completely unjustified and unjust. Yeah. But then it gets to your question is, given the reality of how the NYPD functions and how it engages in abusive practices every day. Like, for example, we did court monitoring today. I and an intern from Prop. We were in Manhattan. And we do court monitoring. We go into the arraignment parts because everyone who gets arrested in New York City has to be arraigned. Mm-hmm. So we sit in the arraignment parts of the court, and we basically record every case that we see, and we, with an emphasis on what's the race of the person who's been arrested, what the charges, and whether they're released. So today is a typical day. 14 out of the 15 cases we saw involved New Yorkers of color. 14 out of 15. Yeah. And I did the calculation, it's 93.3% of the cases. So every day, the NYPD engages in that kind of practice. It's openly racist. There's no way you could explain those kind of numbers. In January of this year, I did a fair amount of court monitoring. I saw 76 cases. 75 involved New Yorkers of color. There was one white person that I saw the cops arrested. And, you could say, well, maybe Black and Latino people commit more street crime or yada, yada, yada. But nothing can explain that disproportion other than the NYPD targets people of color and targets marginalized communities.
Yeah. And, the whistleblower cops, most recently, Edwin Raymond, has spoken widely about this. And a bunch of them came together and they did a documentary called Crime and Punishment.
Right.
And it was about a dozen of them. Yeah. And so they're lifting the veil on what goes on inside the NYPD. And I find it interesting that we're still seeing such a pushback from not just general society, but from city officials, the mayor, the governor, that they seem to just completely ignore the fact that this is a problem. Or when they do address it, they sort of pay it lip service and they just say, our lovely officers are doing the best that they can. There's been bad things done in the past.
Risking their life every day.
Yes, all of the idioms that they use, all of the typical statements. And what I find interesting, Bob, is that now we have this idea that racism is something that's interpersonal primarily, right? And it's rooted in prejudice. And most white people now, you can't get them to say, oh, yeah, I hate Black people. Like, that's not a thing. They're colorblind now. They're like, oh, yeah, I don't even see you as Black. Like, everything's good now. The 60s have long passed. You can sit next to us on the train. Seems good to me. Yet there's this glaring problem of police brutality and
Well,
inequality within the justice
there
system.
is racism probably carried out in one way or another by virtually every institution, government institution. There's no question, for example, I ran for mayor in 2017 in a Democratic primary against de Blasio. So I had to learn about issues other than policing and criminal justice. And one of the things that I looked at with the help of other people were schools in New York City.
Yeah.
And it turns out that the that it can be documented that the schools that have the least resources and the youngest teachers and are most problematic in how they're able to function and deliver educational services are all, without exception, located in Black and Latino communities. So there is I think so racism, as much as it is publicly the kind of the point you're making, a no to in any way say obviously racist things, like to use the N-word or in other ways talk disparagingly about Black or Latino people. The way the institutions function, and I think primarily, but not only by any means, the policing and criminal justice system is deeply racist. Not, I mean, the 90% of the people in Rikers Island are New Yorkers of color. Similar percentages regarding the population in our state prisons in New York. When the police don't harass or arrest people for marijuana possession anymore, except very, very rarely as far as we can see.
Yeah.
But not that long ago, under Michael Bloomberg as mayor, for example, there were some years the cops made over 50,000 marijuana possession arrests. Over 50,000.
Right.
And always over 90% of the arrests involve Black or Latino people, even though research shows that white people use and sell the drugs in equal or greater proportion than Black and Latino people. A district attorney who worked in Manhattan found out about her work, and he reached out to me totally on an anonymous basis, said, you can't reveal who I am and what I'm telling you. And you can reveal what I'm telling you, but you can't attribute it to me. So he said, this was when they were still enforcing the marijuana laws that were on the books at that time. And he said, whenever the cops do a buy and bust operation focused on marijuana, they never go to white communities in Manhattan. They only go to Black and Latino communities in Manhattan.
Yeah. And they do that with all the different crimes they enforce across the board.
Right.
Unless it's something like murder and they got to actually put in investigative work. But when it's the broken windows policing,
Right.
when it's fare evasion, which means jumping the turnstiles and avoiding paying the subway fare, which is like $2.90 now, they arrest people for that. And then they look for, if they have a warrant out, they look for, if they have a criminal record, and then that person just gets caught up in the system based on jumping the turnstiles, which is something everybody does. Like, I've jumped the turnstiles, it doesn't make you a criminal.
Well, I hope nobody breaks in the door here and brings you to the local precinct. You spoke about Edwin Raven before. When I met with him, it was many years ago, when I first met with him, when he became famous and notorious, there was a front page story in the Sunday Times Magazine section about Edwin.
Yeah.
And he told me that after the 6 months of the police academy, he was assigned to transit police. And either the first day or almost the first day, when they were going to bring him and some other rookies to a subway station to show them how to operate, he said what they did is they brought us onto the subway station and they put us in a room that passengers won't even know are there. And we could peer out some kind of opening in the door to see what was happening. And as soon as we saw somebody jump a turnstile, we'd rush out and arrest that person. And Raymond said to me, I thought, okay, they're showing us how to make arrests. That's okay. But then he said, but we went right back in. And that's what we were taught to do. And when Raymond started to argue with them and say, look, isn't it better if I stand in front of the turnstile First of all, if I'm standing in front of the turnstile, you can be sure nobody's going to try to jump the turnstile when there's a cop there. So you've effectively stopped what you're identifying as the problem, but also I'm available to help because people come up to me and ask me this or that. And he was told by the higher ups, nope, we want the numbers. We
Yeah.
want the arrests. And part of the reason for that is, I think, just the deep-seated culture and how they operate. But the other reason is the way they show that they're doing a good job is by saying, look how many arrests we make.
Yeah.
The problem with that is some of the arrests are bogus, and most of the arrests are a function of racial bias.
Right.
But your question was still the the, the fundamental challenge to police reform advocates is we're identifying the problem. We're issuing reports. You have people like Edwin Raymond. They get a fair amount of publicity, and there's documentaries about him. And Edwin wrote a book that got a fair amount of attention. And it's still getting attention, but it's not shifting the political landscape.
Right.
So we still have very few mainstream political figures, if any. I mean, probably people like Ocasio-Cortez or in the city council. I'm forgetting the name at the moment, but she ran for district attorney in Queens and almost won, and now she's city council person. Oh, I'm embarrassed that I can't remember her name. But
Tiffany Caban?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank God. Oh my gosh. I was like, if she's the exact wrong person, I'm going to be mortified.
No, but she's exactly who I was thinking about. And but she and the people like her are not shifting, not because of any lack of effort on their part, or not being significantly effective in shifting the political landscape. So strong measures would be taken to curb abusive policing.
Yeah. And, people like you, Bob, who try to do it the right way, it sounds like you've really had a life journey of committing to this work and showing up daily. And you've seen the movement go through the ages, you've seen the wins, you've seen the failures or the steps back, I guess. And you've kept showing up. Oh my gosh, I lost my train of thought. I was like, wait, what was my point?
How do I deal with? I don't know where you're going exactly where you're going with this, but some
but
people
you got a
have
thought.
said you're like Sisyphus. You're pushing the rock up the mountain.
Yes.
But you're not having significant success.
Oh, I got my point back. Okay. So, I don't want to do things like the Black Panthers did. And I think that there was space for that. And that was necessary because they brought about so much change. And I think they had good motivations. Personally, I do believe in nonviolence and in Dr. King's way of thinking. But it does feel like, what do we do? Do we just keep talking about it? Do we keep publishing our little reports? Do we keep, what do we need to do to change things, to, get them to understand, no, we don't just mean this is a fun topic to talk about in academic settings.
I mean, that's the fundamental question.
That's the big question.
Right. And I don't have, and I do this work, and I've done this work, virtually all my adult life, all my professional life has been devoted one way or another to the kind of work we're talking about. Since 2011, when I with some other people founded PROP, I've been focused on policing issues.
Yeah.
And policing issues, in my judgment, and promoting police reform is the hardest task to achieve. I mentioned before I worked at the Correctional Association for almost 30 years. We achieved some significant successes. The significant reform of mandatory sentencing laws, for example, so that at one point the prison population in New York State was over 70,000. In 1973, before the passage of mandatory sentencing laws, it was 12,500. By the late 1990s, it was over 70,000. That was the extraordinary growth in the number of people locked up in New York State. and partly because of efforts of reformers, not only, but to a certain extent reformers, and that after a while, some mainstream politicians began to see it that way and act that way. Editorial boards began to see it and write editorials about it. Prison population in New York State now is still too high, but it's under 40,000.
Yeah.
At one point, when Mayor Dinkins was mayor, the jail population in Rikers was over 20,000. Now it's about 6,000. So that there have been significant changes in the reality of prison and jail in New York State. Still too many people locked up, and the conditions are still horrific, especially on Rikers Island. So it's
And
not
there's
as
the
if,
campaign to close
Right,
Rikers Island
right.
and to create borough-based jails, which
Right.
is getting pushed back by the city, by, Mayor Adams. They're
Right.
trying to push it way back
we
to
don't even
2034 or so.
we didn't support that plan. We're
Oh,
not alone.
were you no new jails?
Yeah, yes.
Okay. I was part of that moment. That was quite a moment.
Well, Prop was never like fully engaged in the actual no new jails movement, but
Yeah,
we took the
okay.
position separately. You don't want to spend 10, 11, 12 billion dollars on building new jails in New York City because we know, and this is historically true, every time a new jail is built and there is promises that this is a step forward, eventually those jails and those prisons become corrupt places and places where brutality and cruelty is endemic. And the reason for that is institutionally, if you build, prisons and jails are institutionally and fundamentally going to breed brutality and corruption. Because what you have is people in power over people who are totally helpless and subject to the people in power. And you don't have sufficient monitoring of how the people in power are going to operate. When I was in school, we were taught some British statesman said power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. And it's true. It's true about the NYPD. One of the reasons they get away with as much as they get away with is because they have virtually absolute power.
Yeah.
And it is as blatant as I point to the incident that took place in Times Square in late January when there was a video of quote unquote migrant men beating up cops and kicking cops who were on the ground.
Yes.
And how the outcry rose from that, and people were saying how terrible, how inhumane. We got to ship these people, out of New York City. Later on, Alvin Bragg, the Manhattan DA, made public a longer video which showed how it began. I don't know if you're aware of this.
Definitely.
So that video showed, first of all, that the men were not blocking pedestrian traffic, as the cops had claimed. You saw they were just standing on the sidewalk, but near the curb, and people were walking by freely.
Yeah.
And also, what you saw is the fight, the physical confrontation was initiated by the cop.
Yes.
He attacked one of the again migrant men as he was walking away following their order.
Yes.
And he threw him up against the wall, and he was being very punishing. And eventually, the guy pushed back. They fell on the ground. The cop on top of him.
Yeah.
And then the other men came over and started pushing the cop and kicking the cop at that point.
Yeah. And, that's a case I've been following closely because I've been writing an article about it. And what strikes me is that the officer, to me, it was an abuse of power, and it was like an ego move because, like you said, the migrants, there were a few of them there, but they weren't blocking the sidewalk. It's a very broad sidewalk because it's Times Square. It was one of the main streets, like West 40th or West 41st, one of those. And they were just hanging around. And then the cops said, "Okay, guys, go to this other street.
Go to 41st Street."
They were all walking away. The one in the yellow jacket, his name is Henry Brito. And he was walking away. He grabbed a stroller. And then as he's walking away, he sort of muttered, "Oh, he looks like Ugly Betty," in Spanish. The officer presumably heard that. And I think that's what triggered him. And
Absolutely.
he jacked Yo Henry up against a wall
Yeah.
really violently. And then Yo Henry is seen in the video like, what is your problem? Why are you doing this?
Yeah.
And then I think he throws him to the ground. And then the both officers are now scuffling with him. And that's when the other
Right.
migrants start punching and kicking them, which they're wrong for doing. But
I'm not even, I
how?
mean, at a certain point, at least they started by
Yeah.
protecting Brito, who was laying
That's
on.
what they were trying to do,
Right.
you know?
And what was interesting in terms of the problem that we've identified is how do you change things is the NYPD spokesman, even after the video came out, which showed what really happened, kept saying that Brito disobeyed a lawful order. It was, I don't know particularly why it's lawful to say people have to move where
It's
they were
not
standing
lawful.
around.
So Brito's lawyer, Mark Jankowicz, is arguing that the order that the officer gave in the first place was unlawful. You,
Yeah.
as an officer, cannot tell someone to move somewhere when you're not doing anything illegal. So
Right. My
the
guess
order
is
was illegal.
somebody, this is totally speculation. I don't have any information about this, but some of the businesses on 42nd Street didn't like that these migrants were hanging out
Yeah.
in front of different places,
Yeah.
and they wanted to move to 41st Street. But it wasn't as if the men, as you were pointing out, were doing anything unlawful. So the businesses contacted the local precinct and said, "Can you get these people out of here?" And these two cops were told, get them to move along. And then what transpired is what you and I just described.
Right.
Similar thing is happening with the cops killing a mentally troubled young man, 19 years old,
Yeah.
who called the police. He called 911. Two cops show up, and eventually they shoot him and kill him.
Yeah.
And the video just came out, which showed clearly, from my perspective, it was an unjustified shooting.
Absolutely.
But the NYPD is still saying he charged them with the scissors, and that is not what the video shows. And it's also particularly the incident that we described where Brito teases the cop about Ugly Betty, and then the cop flips and attacks him. My first encounter with police violence was very similar. I had the job that I described at the beginning of our interview. I was 22 years old. Somehow we got tickets to a ball game at Yankee Stadium, and I'm a big Yankee fan, so I was happy to go. I had 10 tickets, so I brought 10 of the young men that I work with, and I made the mistake of sitting in the middle of the aisle, and the 10 boys were all to my right to the aisle. And one of the boys that came was a boy whose first name was Charlie, who was a troublemaker. And he began throwing paper cups down below us and would bother the crowd below us. And I almost was sure it was he, but I never saw him do it. I would see the cups flying. So in any case, at a certain point, a white guy from the stands below starts arguing with Charlie, and in a hostile way, and they agree to meet in the aisle to fight. Now, I knew enough about Charlie that you were like, kid in a candy store giving him candy. He would love to do this. So he goes to the aisle. The white guy comes up. I'm scrambling over the 10 kids between me and the aisle. I get to the aisle, and luckily, the white guy has no interest in actually fighting. You could just tell. So I breathe a sigh of relief. There's not going to be a fight among the kids that I bring to Yankee Stadium. So Charlie goes back to his seat. The guy goes back to his seat. Bunch of cops rush up, just like hot wired. You could just feel it like that. What's going on? What's going on? What's going on? Because they saw a little crowd develop. And I said, take it easy. Problem solved. Peace has been restored. And then one of the boys that I brought, who was standing close to the cop, I remember his name, George, was a sweet kid, not quote unquote a troublemaker kid. And he says to the cop, "Be cool." That was it. And the cop jumps across me to start beating up on George.
Oh my God.
And I was, again, 22 years old. I was completely shocked. I said, "This is crazy." So then another cop jumps past me. I thought all this is happening in seconds to grab the first cop because the first cop acted in such a irresponsible, violent manner. No, he jumped across me to join in pounding on George. So a little melee broke out, and we were ushered out of the stadium.
Yeah.
And at one point, I saw that a bunch of the cops had surrounded one of the boys that I brought. His name was Juan. And there was like 4 or 5 cops, including one cop had his hand on Juan's neck. I separated the cops, took the hand off his neck, and grabbed Juan and said, I have him. You could back up. And then some PR guy who must have heard about what was going on sort of rushed up to us. And he said to Juan, what's the matter with you? Are you crazy? Like fighting the cops. And Juan says to him, no, I'm not crazy. Are you crazy? And I just loved his defiance.
Yeah.
And I explained to the guy, this was not on us. This was on your cops. And I found out later, some of them were NYPD off-duty cops. And I didn't think the guy particularly believed me, but he contacted the community center where I worked, and he gave us another 10 tickets to go to another game. But
That's
it was
good.
But the reason I brought up the story was not only to tell you my first experience, was that here's a cop who reacted in a violent fashion because he thought what some kid said to him was disrespectful. And what the kid said to him was, be cool. And I assume it was a similar kind of dynamic when Burrito started singing Ugly Betty.
Right.
That the cop was insulted, you offended him, and I'm not going to take that kind of crap from you.
Right. But look at the scale of how it's blown up, because now those 2 officers, Ben Korean and Zhang Zhu Tian,
Okay, you
it's
remember
a
the
little
names?
bit of, yes,
Yeah.
I've been really studying this. They have been invited to the State of the Union address. They posed for pictures with Republican congressmen. They've been celebrated on social media by, of course, right-wing people or people that just want to support the blue. Meanwhile, these defendants, they're in court. They
Well,
are
a couple
showing
of
up
them
to
are
court
facing
cases. Some of them are
serious
in
prison time.
jail. Yeah,
Yeah.
their freedom is at stake here for something that is so minor. In fact, something that was done to them.
Exactly. They did not, even when they came and started beating on the cops and kicking them, they did not behave in a criminal way. The cops behaved in a criminal way.
Right.
And but it gets to the again, the fundamental question you asked is, how do we change things? How do we, given the way our world lionizes police, and even when there's evidence, there's this video that showed how these cops behave.
Yeah.
The DA is still moving to try and convict people like Brito, and the public is still, and the police department is still defending these men. What the police department should do, if they were doing their job, when you have men with badges and guns and nightsticks operating this way, abusing people unnecessarily, they should be fired immediately. You do this, you are not operating the way a police officer should operate, and we no longer have you on the force. That's not the way it operates.
Instead, they reward them. They
Right.
rarely ever discipline their cops, especially for stuff that involves mistreating the public.
Right.
You know?
It's similar to, in my mind, to the way the Catholic Church operated for centuries, protecting priests because they thought they were protecting the institution
Yeah.
of the Catholic Church. And what they did was protect priests and safeguard priests who were preying on children.
Yeah.
And what the police department does is protect officers who act in an abusive way to citizens. It's not a well-to-do white person. It's not a person who has leverage or access to influential agents within the larger society. It's almost always people like Brito and the migrants. Almost always people like Eric Garner, who the cops killed.
Yeah.
Killed, captured on video.
Yeah.
And it still took 5 or 6 years before the police department fired, I think the guy's name was Pantaleo,
Yeah.
officer
Daniel
who choked,
Panaleo, yeah.
clearly choked not Brito, choked Eric Garner and killed him.
Yeah. Yeah, I was actually at the protest for that one to get that cop fired.
Right.
And my other guest, his name is Vidal Guzman. He was an activist leading that protest, so I
Right.
distinctly remember that situation. But
But the issue is, though,
mhm,
I mean, I think it's whatever, fine to advocate firing the police officers who are responsible, like firing the two guys who jumped Brito, firing the officers who killed Rosino or Rosini,
Rosario,
the Rosario, right,
yeah,
the
Wade
mentally
Rosario,
troubled man who they killed. But that doesn't solve the problem. What we need is systemic change, institutional
exactly.
change, and we need to significantly reduce the power of the police department, to reduce the funding of the police department, to reduce the number of cops we have,
Hmm.
and to begin to give the jobs that the cops now do to other agencies, community-based agencies or government agencies. For example, a classic is similar to with the situation involving Rosario or
Yeah, Rosario.
okay, involving that young man. Shouldn't be sending cops to deal with mentally
No.
troubled people. We should send
Yeah.
mental health professionals. A simple policy change. I mean, it would probably complicated how to implement it, but you should not be sending police with guns and badges and nightsticks who primarily been trained to quote unquote solve problems through the use of force to deal with mentally troubled people.
Yeah.
And it has resulted in, I forget the exact number, I think since 2015, I think 18 people have died as a result of the actions of cops when they show up when there's a mentally troubled person. And over 80% of those people are people of color. And so the kind of changes that we promote at PROP and other police reform organizations promote are fundamental and sweeping,
Yeah.
because that's the only thing that's going to address the serious problem.
Exactly.
We know that, and research shows and experience shows, training does not do it.
Mm-hmm.
More diversity, having more Black and Latino cops does not do it.
Mm-hmm.
Someone said, writing about this, said, if you're a Black cop, you're a cop. And that means you have to get with the program. You have to meet the quota. And you have to engage in the kind of practices that will enable you to succeed within the department. And those practices aren't in the service of particularly poor, marginalized people in our city.
Absolutely. Yeah.
In fact, those practices that get rewarded by the NYPD involve inflicting harm in one way or another on marginalized groups.
Yeah.
The man I referred to earlier, the DA, who worked in the Manhattan DA's office, this many, many years ago, when he and I met, and he was a good man and an earnest man, and he had taken on the job of being a Manhattan DA because he thought he could change things from within, and he found that he really couldn't, except in some isolated cases. We had a cup of coffee, and as we're getting up to leave, he said, "We harm people every day." And that simple statement, it really stayed with me, because as you and I are talking, whatever this was, however long this interview was, the police in New York City have arrested a Black or Latino person or several Black or Latino people for bogus reasons and have treated them badly. And I mean, just the process of arresting people, you're locking them up for a day or two before they even get to arraignment. And what kind of experience is that to inflict on people for no good reason?
Yeah. Well, Bob, unfortunately, we're drawing to the end of our time, but I just want to thank you so much for coming on and for sharing everything you have. I am optimistic, and I have faith that this work is going to continue and we're going to see even more significant changes. And it's thanks to people like you. So I really...
Well, the point I want to make, and it's going to sound cynical, negative, when you said more significant changes, we have not seen any significant changes in policing. We have not.
There we go.
It is as blatantly racist as it ever was. And the cops operate with impunity almost entirely. Rare instances where there's a price that a police officer pays for their violent, aggressive, or biased behavior. We've seen it. There's been very little mainstream reporting on how the cops operated when they have taken down the encampments and arrested the protesting students who were protesting Israel's actions in Gaza. But you read the reports written by the college journalists, and you see that the cops have brutalized people, have beaten people unnecessarily, have punished people unnecessarily, and people who are essentially helpless before the physical force of the police department. And that is not being sufficiently publicized, and so it's another instance where the lack of accountability is enabling police officers in New York City to behave in just violent, aggressive ways.
Yeah. And you know what? You've said it well. We'll end on that note. Bob, thank you so much for coming.
Right, and
stay woke.
Okay. Can we give contact information for Prop?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So
you can
if
tell
you're yes. Anastasia engrossed me so effectively, I didn't turn and speak to the audience as sufficiently often. So if you're interested in finding out more about PROP, you can go to our website, the Police Reform Organizing Project.org, or you can contact me directly. My email is rpagangi at gmail.com. Again, RPA stands for my full name, Robert Peter Alfred, Gangi at gmail.com. Or you can call me, 917-327-7648, 917-327-7648. Thank you, and onward.
Onward. Thank you guys for joining us today. Bye.